The question is now on adoption and favorably reporting the contempt report as amended and transmitting the report as adopted for filing as a privileged report to the House of Representatives. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the Chair, the ayes have it. The roll call has been requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Chaffetz?
Aye.
Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Mica? Aye. Mr. Mica votes aye. Mr. Turner? Mr. Duncan? Mr. Duncan votes aye. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Walberg? Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes yes. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Desjardins votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Mrs. Lummis? Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes yes. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes yes. Mr. Mulvaney? Mr. Buck? Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes yes. Mr. Blum? Mr. Blum votes yes. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Russell? Mr. Carter? Mr. Grothman? Mr. Grothman votes yes. Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes yes. Mr. Cummings? Mr. Cummings votes no. Ms. Maloney? Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton? Mr. Clay? Mr. Clay votes no. Mr. Lynch? Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly?
Never, no how, no way, no.
Mr. Connolly votes no. Ms. Duckworth? Ms. Duckworth votes no. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Lawrence votes no. Mr. Liu? Ms. Watson-Coleman? Ms. Watson-Coleman votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Ms. Plaskett votes no. Mr. Desaulniers? Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Mr. Boyle? Mr. Boyle votes no. Mr. Welch? Mr. Welch votes no. Ms. Lujan Grisham? Ms. Lujan Grisham votes no.
How is the member from the District of Columbia recorded?
Ms. Norton is not recorded. Ms. Norton votes no.
Does any other member, have all members been recorded? Oh.
Ms. Lummis is not recorded. Ms. Lummis votes yes.
Have all members had an opportunity to vote? Anybody else? How is the member from Michigan, Mr. Walberg, recorded?
Mr. Walberg is not recorded. He votes yes.
We good? Anybody else coming? Anybody else? I think we're good. Clerk will report the tally.
On this vote, there are 19 yeas and 15 nays.
The ayes have it, and the report as amended is ordered favorably reported. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Without objection, pursuant to Clause 2L of House Rule 11, members will have 2 days to submit their views on the report considered today. I ask unanimous consent that the staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the report ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Hearing no objections, so ordered. There's no further business. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.